The NFL always has competitive nature. You know, we talked in the 3 o'clock hour about how the NBA almost endorses mediocrity. The NFL endorses mediocrity because if you are mediocre, you do have a shot. Unlike the NBA, John McMullen, you can be 9-7 and be the 6th seed and make a run to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, you can. I mean, it's happened so many times in the past. You see the 2 New York Giants, recent Super Bowl champions, the one beating the 16-0 Patriots team. We mentioned last week, we talked about some of the great teams. That 15-1 Packers team from 2011. They didn't win the Super Bowl, but the 10-6 6th seed did. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of what fuels the NFL's popularity, I think, is the parity aspect. And so many teams this time of year, their fan bases think they have a chance. And they're probably right, to be honest, because the difference between the really, really good teams in this league and the average teams, it's not that great. And it can shift dramatically from year to year. Most recently, you saw it with another 15-1 team, the Carolina Panthers, going from first to last in a very good division, the NFC South. So, and by the way, they could bounce back this season and be right back at the top of it.
Yeah.
And that's how razor sharp the margin of error is in the NFL. And that's good because we talked about the NBA. There's 2 teams that have a chance to win the title.
Right, I mean, just think about this.
And that's not good.
The Carolina Panthers went 15-1 and went to the Super Bowl. And you would think, man, this team is set up. They were young. This team is set up for many, many runs. And the next year they don't make the playoffs. Could you imagine a 70-plus win Warriors team not making the playoffs the very next season? I mean, it's almost incomprehensible.
It is incomprehensible unless unless
they lost the whole
hurt,
right.
And Klay Thompson. Yeah. It just doesn't happen, and that's part of the problem. How many finals has LeBron James been in consecutively now? I mean, you're talking about, in my opinion, one of the 5 best players of all time in the NBA, but it's still, a lot of fan bases can't sit there this time of year and say, my team has a legitimate shot to win the NBA title. I think that's a problem. And it's always been a problem for that league because it's such a superstar-driven sport, but it's worse now than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, and I know young people are not going to hear this, but if they eliminated the three-point shot, 10 teams would be in contention. And if they at least moved it back to where it was originally when it was first inserted, made it a more difficult shot, it opens up the game, but people don't want to hear that.
You know what? I don't know that that's I think people would – no, I see what you're saying, but I think that people do want to see a more competitive league like football. That's why football is so popular. Look, basketball is popular. It's even gaining popularity. It's got the youngest audience. But football's a monster, and it's because every game matters. And I understand there's only 16 games against 82, but you know what? Every game matters, and 9-7 is just as good as 11-5 or 12-4 as long as you just get in. 42 wins in the NBA, you are irrelevant for the most part.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And I think, if you go back, I think, the game has changed so dramatically over the years. I remember when Julius Erving won the MVP in Philadelphia, which I think was 81. That was the first time in well over a decade, I think 15, 16 years, that a non-center won the MVP award in the NBA, which tells you how drastically the game has changed, because centers are virtually irrelevant in today's game, because it's just, common sense mathematics. When you got guys who can shoot 40% from three, think about 4 of 10, that's 12 points. So how do you match that?
Yeah.
If you're going inside to a center, you got to shoot 60%. It's common sense. If they went back to the old system, you would have more teams involved. Obviously, the big guys would be more key to the actual game, and you would have more competitiveness. But I think some of the excitement leaves the game, and nobody's interested in that.
John McMullen's with us. John, thinking about competitiveness, ESPN's Pro Football Focus ranked the Eagles as the 15th best roster in the league, and that would suggest that they are right in the middle of the pack. And last year, interestingly enough, they ranked them as the 5th best roster. Wouldn't you think this roster's better than last year's roster? Obviously, they were way off on last year's team, but the fact that they're in the middle of the pack, I mean, I guess that almost suggests, even though not as high as last year, it almost suggests that they think they're better, in a weird way, right?
Yeah, I think it does. I think most people assume they're better. One of the problems with those ratings, and we talked about the offensive line being number one yesterday, is that it's all based on last season. And I understand it. That's all you can base it on. But let's be honest, it doesn't mean much. For instance, the number 2 team in the offensive line rankings was the 1-15 Cleveland Browns. Now, why is that? Because they signed J.C. Treader away from the Packers. They signed Kevin Zeitler away from the Bengals. 2 high-level players, but they've never played in Cleveland before. Now, on paper, it looks great, but we all know what is the offensive line in the NFL about. It's about continuity.
Right.
It's about learning to play with the guy next to you. So while you look at an individual player on a piece of paper and you say, wow, this guy's good, and this guy's better than this other guy, it doesn't necessarily translate to the field. So, I think as far as the Eagles roster goes, I think what they've done well is they built the team in the fashion they should have. Now we have to sit back and wait and see how all the parts and pieces fit together. But what they've done in building this team, it makes sense. And I think that's more important than any of the sort of white noise.
John, they label I want to really get your take on this, because I think if you told Eagles fans that Brandon Graham is an elite player in this league, they would probably scoff at that, don't you think? And yet he was rated as...
Most would, but
right, well,
they're all wrong. Right,
well, that's what I'm saying, is Pro Football Focus rated him, and we've seen him, he's like the second best pass rusher behind Khalil Mack in the league, even though he doesn't have double-digit sacks. I mean, they rated him as an elite player in this league. I think a lot of Eagles fans would be surprised by that.
Yeah, I think they are, because of the narrative and the fact that he was labeled a bust early in his career. And I think people hang on to that. And the assumption is you can improve. Well, the assumption's wrong. He has improved. And it's not just Pro Football Focus. You talk to coaches around the league and scouts and assistants. And when we got a chance over the spring to talk to all the Eagles assistants, you can hear the reverence they speak of Brandon Graham and how good of a player that he's developed into. He was a second-team All-Pro last season, which has nothing to do with Pro Football Focus. I mean, everybody in this league seems to recognize how good Brandon Graham is, except the people watching him every week. And, it's a head-scratcher to me, because he's one of the best defensive players. He's one of the best players on this team. And I think it all hedges back to the original draft, and people thought Earl Thomas would have been a better selection. People thought Jason Pierre-Paul would have been a better selection. Long term, they're probably right with Earl Thomas, who's a Hall of Fame level player. I'm not sure they are right with JPP. I think Brandon Graham's a better all-around player right now than Jason Pierre-Paul is.
John McMullen's with me right here, 97.3 ESPN. The article also goes on to say, obviously, the biggest weakness on this team is the cornerback position. I don't think there's any debate between any NFL person, any Eagles fan out there. But they do rank Jalen Mills as the worst player on the roster. Don't tell that to Jim Schwartz and the Eagles, though, right?
No. And that's an example of what's wrong with Pro Football Focus. Look, he was thrown into the
I should say this. They didn't rank him as the worst player on the roster, the worst starter on the roster.
Yeah. Well, and they graded him as the worst cornerback in football last season of the guys who played enough to be graded. But understand, he was a rookie, 7th round pick, thrown into the deep end of the pool. And, yeah, did he struggle at times? No question. A lot. But he kept his head up. He didn't, the one thing the Eagles always say about him is he competes. He doesn't let negative plays affect him, which is huge for a cornerback. And they come back after an off season, and he's their best corner. He is their number one cornerback. Now, I'm not trying to paint that as that's a good situation, because it's not. You'd prefer to have Patrick Peterson, obviously. You'd prefer to have a better player in that type of situation. But there's no question the Eagles think he's better than Patrick Robinson. They think he's better than Rasul Douglas, who's a 3rd-round pick. They think he's better than anybody else on this roster. That might change when Sidney Jones gets healthy. But at this point, they have a lot of confidence in him. They think he's going to show a lot of improvement, and we'll see. Jim Schwartz is one of those guys who will scoff at Pro Football Focus for that reason. And there's a lot of coaches in this league that scoff at it. There are a lot of good things to what they do, but there are some bad things. And Jalen Mills, because he struggled as a rookie who was forced into action, does not make him a bad football player.
We're talking with John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. You wrote an article today. We've seen this a lot around the league, and the Eagles are jumping in on it. LeGarrette Blount, the Eagles would like him to slim down a little bit, and they are offering him some cashola to do it.
Yeah, $50,000 he gets if he can arrive at training camp between 240 and 245.
Man. We have a little weight loss challenge going on in the building. If they put $50,000 on the line, I think I'd move my ass a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They listed him at 250. I got to get in on that, by the way. But they listed.
Hey, I'm already down 50. I'm down 15, man. Can you catch me?
Well, you got a big head start. I had to be notified of this.
We just started. It's from now to. By the way, it's from now until Labor Day. So you're in. You're in.
All right, I'm in. But they listed him at 250. But I talked to people around the Eagles. It's probably really closer to 260, maybe even a little bit above that. So it's a fine line. He's a guy I mentioned when the Eagles signed him. He's obviously a huge guy. He's bigger than any linebacker by far they have on this team. But he doesn't look, when you look at him, like he's tremendously overweight. But there's a fine line, and they think that he's at his best when he's at 240 or 245, and that's where they want him at. And we'll see what happens when he shows up.
John, you wrote another piece at 97.3 ESPN.com today. Football fans, Eagles fans, make sure you're checking out the website daily. And this is an interesting one because the legalized betting on NFL games is getting closer and closer, and we know that the Supreme Court is set to take on New Jersey in an attempt to get sports betting here in the state.
Yeah, they're going to hear it's 2 combined cases. State of New Jersey, basically against the NCAA and the thoroughbred horse racing versus the state of New Jersey, and they've combined them. And ultimately, this will be the case. It's going to be heard in October that will decide if there can be sports betting really anywhere, because there's a 1992 law that was sort of put in to protect Vegas that disallowed sports betting on a federal level. Now, most people think this is, the first step because of the makeup of the court. They're generally going to lean on states' rights first, so they're probably going to kick it back to that. That's what everyone thinks. And ultimately, if that's the case, well, that means sports betting is going to be legal. So get ready. It's coming sooner rather than later.
And how was the league? Are they okay with that? Is this
their? Yeah, I think ultimately they'll be okay because they'll be able to monetize it. You know, it's one of those weird things that the NFL's always had a strange hypocrisy-based relationship with gambling. Obviously, gambling is a big reason why the NFL is so popular. We mentioned parity. You can throw betting and gambling in there as another reason.
No question.
And the fact that, you know, newspapers, if anybody reads them, have any longer.
I like the part in the story where you said they're those pieces of paper that are folded up. Wink.
Yeah, so you know the lines are in there. They're not for entertainment purposes only, and you know the injury reports. Why do they exist? Obviously, sort of to even the playing field for bettors around the country. It's always been that way. Everyone knows it. It's a wink-wink type of thing, but. You know, the NFL's been slow because there's so many moral objections. I still hear them today. You know, when I worked at the Sports Network, FanRag Sports has the same problem. There are so many advertisers that don't want anything involving gambling because there's this moral objection to it. And I just find it bizarre. Nobody's advocating betting, but if something happens and it's legal, you can't pretend it's not. I've never understood the backlash against something that obviously exists.
Yeah, it should be interesting. And we know that New Jersey, that going back to the 70s, really, when they got shut out on that vote, has really been trying to figure out a way to get it back. It could certainly help revitalize our area as well.
Well, yeah, Atlantic City, and that's one of the reasons I wrote about it. Obviously, the explosion of casinos really destroyed Atlantic City in a lot of ways because people on the East Coast no longer have to take the bus down if they want to gamble. There's so many facilities up and down and all over the place where you can go. And one of the things they wanted to do to combat that was the legalized sports betting, and I think it would help. The city, certainly, if it's confined to Atlantic City and you can't do it anywhere else, that could revitalize the entire city.
Hopefully, it does make an impact here in the area, which is, by the way, turning around. There are a lot of good things happening in the city, which I drive through each and every day on my way to work. I see the Stockton Durhams going up over there on the beach. I see the South Jersey Gas being built rather rapidly. That thing's going up very fast. So if you haven't been in the Atlantic City area, not that that really has anything to do with this conversation, I'm just letting you know, there is some movement going on over there, and it's good to see. John McMullen is pontificating about the Eagles and the NFL at JF McMullen on Twitter. And we, of course, will continue to talk NFL as the Eagles are just about 4 weeks away from the start of training camp at the NovaCare Center. All right, pal, we'll talk tomorrow.
All right, thank you, Mike.